Hello, everyone. We are very excited to be here on this sunny day. I would remind everyone on screen to mute themselves during the while others are talking, just to avoid the echo. We are very excited to have Jacqueline Gottlieb here today. She's the director of Attention and Decision Lab at Columbia University, studying how our thoughts shape our actions and how our actions shape and focus our thoughts. And this link between cognition and decision-making is studied in her lab in behavioral, computational, and physiological terms. We also learned that other than playing piano and having lived in many places on Earth, she's learning something that I think pickleball, which is kind of a racquetball. I don't even know what it is, but it sounds like a good activity to learn during a pandemic where we are all mostly stationary. As a reminder, the Learning Salon is a forum for interdisciplinary discussions at the intersection of artificial and biological learning. We discuss contentions and bridges between the two. It's an interdisciplinary forum, so if you are from a different discipline or you're a junior, please feel free to ask your clarification questions in the chat. There is an Ask a Question button below while Jackie gives her brief 10 to 20 minute talk. Please ask your questions and vote on each other's questions. We will bring the highest voting questions on screen. You will notice that John Krakauer is not here today. Unfortunately, he had an emergency and he couldn't join us. We are hoping that everything is well, and he will hopefully join us next week. Also remember to be very polite with everyone. Disagreements are very much encouraged, but with politeness and respect. If you are a junior person, we do encourage you to ask your questions, clarification in the chat, or ask a question area for more serious questions. We try to maintain a flat hierarchy for disciplines and for different people at different stages so that the spirit of discussion is what sustains the salon, as those of you who have joined before would know. Yeah, we all hope that everything is okay. It's not John himself, but there's some other things going on. So we hope that everything is okay. All right, with that, I'm gonna give it to Jackie, and thank you everyone for being here on a sunny day. Take it away, Jackie, and you can, I guess, share your screen again because we don't have it right.
Screen. Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Aida. This is very, very exciting to be here. And okay, let me see if I can do my 15-minute introduction. So I thought it was 30 minutes. But I just learned it's 15.
You're welcome to take 30 minutes.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Well, let's see. Okay, you can see my screen? Everybody can see my screen? Yes, I assume.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the title of today is Active Learning and Discovery. So, you know, if you think about active learning, so there's active here, and active to a psychologist or neuroscientist means motivated behavior, right? So we talk about motivated action and reward-based actions. And then learning and discovery has something to do with structure in the world, information, or reduction of uncertainty. So together, if you think about active learning, that's pretty much everything that the brain does. So this 15-minute, I was reminded there's a famous quote about from a Jewish student in an olden days who went to a rabbi and said, "Rabbi, teach me the Torah while I stand on one leg." So this was Rabbi Hillel, a very famous one. He gave a very good answer. Now, I don't know, it's a pretty much one sentence answer. I don't know if I'll be as good as that, but I'll do my best. So let's start by, we can at least define the question a little bit. So my favorite definition of active learning and the reason for looking into it comes from a picture such as this one. I lifted it from a particular paper, but it could be really any of many models of decision-making that we use in the field today. So this is a model showing how we conceptualize decision-making in neuroscience and psychology these days. Okay, so you have an input layer of several stimuli. They are mapped into fewer actions. In this case, it's A and B. There's some circuitry by which these actions compete. you eventually one wins, you take an action, you get a reward, or you observe some sort of consequence. That consequence then generates some plasticity, and you reward the synapses that led to the action if it's a good action. Otherwise, you weaken those synapses. Okay, so that's our concept. So you'll see that here, there is a proper circuit for learning how to map visual stimuli onto action inputs, right? So the action selection is endogenously optimized, meaning that this circuit by itself learns how to take good actions that lead to reward. But notice here, when you look at the stimulus layer, what do you see about the stimulus layer? The stimulus layer has no feedback going into it. In other words, it is exogenous. And this is one of the huge assumptions that we make in neuroscience and psychology, is that information is given to us. It comes, we don't know how it arrives to us, but we just assume that it is there. And you see here, there are 10 stimuli. Of course, in the real world, there are a lot more than 10 stimuli. And so there's an implicit selection in this picture. And that is a selection that we would normally do by attending to some stimuli and ignoring others. But you see that even that selection is exogenous. That is given to us. In other words, okay, so that is the major simplifying assumption that we have adopted for a long time. There's another simplifying assumption here, and that is that the rewards are given. And that, a bigger way of saying is that the goals that we should pursue are given, pre-specified to us. That's another big topic that maybe these two are related, but we can talk about in the discussion. Okay, so we know that in natural behavior, this isn't really the case, because in the sense of information being given, because we have active sensing mechanisms. We have some control over our attention. We know that we can direct attention as a function of what we do, as a function of what we want to achieve. So what we need to, the way we need to think about the circuit, we need to think about having some sort of feedback from our action and our goals, some sort of mechanism that tell the brain, given that that is your goal, attend to these stimuli. And it is this feedback loop that we haven't really been studying, but we really need to study if we want to have any sort of understanding of realistic decisions and realistic behaviors. Okay, so I mentioned that this loop is really evidenced in the control of attention, and we know quite a bit about the attention network, the executive network of the human brain and of the monkey brain, and it is an extensive network. And here I'm showing it to you in a human brain, and we think of it as having two major components. So the lateral parts of the executive networks, that's the frontal cortex, the parietal cortex, we think that they have to do with sort of implementing an attentional policy. So what I mean by that is that's a sort of top-down signals that select features, and they say, let's say the right side of space is relevant now, pay attention, or move your eyes, there's the left side of space, or color red is relevant, and so on and so forth. A good shorthand for this is, we think of it in terms of a visual priority map. So a lot of this we learned in the domain of vision. That's why I'll be talking about vision here. So for example, if you have several stimuli in your visual field, let's say 8, this priority map encodes stimuli, and it tells you something about the location of these stimuli. And also the main point here is that the priority map responds very little to most stimuli, and it just pulls out 1 or 2 or 3 that are behaviorally relevant or salient for you at that point. Okay, how is this selection accomplished? That is a big open question, and that really reflects a gap that I told you before. We know that the selection has happened. We don't know how it's happening in the context of a behavior. Okay, there's also another part, very important part of this executive network. The anterior cingulate cortex is the most studied portion area that has to do with this. And this part does something that we can call monitoring. Monitoring involves monitoring the value that a particular task has for you, and also how well you are performing the task. So how important is something for me, and how well am I performing? So this here is taken from a paper, Silvetti et al. 2018, who have a computational mechanism that embodies most of our understanding of this network. So we think that the ACC interacts with the brain reward systems. This is the ventral tegmental area that releases dopamine to most of the brain. And also the ACC interacts with a small brainstem nucleus that releases norepinephrine, and that is called the locus ceruleus. So we think that by virtue of inputs, dopamine inputs from the VTA, the ACC can estimate the rewards that are being obtained or not. And when the ACC detects a need for control, let's say you're not doing well enough, it has descending projections to the locus ceruleus, and it calls for a boost in norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is then broadcast broadly throughout the brain, and it has it has a benefit of enhancing performance. So it increases sensory gains, it modulates learning rates, it increases arousal, pupil size, and so on. So norepinephrine is thought to be, this call for a boost of norepinephrine is thought to be it could be a correlate of effort, mental effort, that you exert in order to obtain the desired rewards. The ACC is conceptualized as having two outputs. So one is providing information about the value and also modulating action selection. So actions that we use to act on the world, let's say climbing a ladder, how much effort should I exert in climbing this ladder? And also ACC has outputs that are internally oriented, right? So it could be, so this noradrenergic loop is in fact an internally oriented action. In other words, by calling for a boost of norepinephrine, the ACC can regulate your information processing, how well you process information.
Sorry,
okay,
Jacqueline, do you mind pressing that height so we can see your slides? Yeah, you see the below there is like a little bar. You press it.
Hi.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So in this paper from Silvetti et al., this paper shows how this model can reproduce a host of findings that have to do from tasks that involve learning, conditioning, memory. Strangely enough, however, there is no connection of this executive circuitry, of this monitoring circuitry, with visual priority maps, so with selective attention. Even though executive and attention are almost synonymous with each other, it's a strange thing in our field that ACC is studied separately from the frontoparietal network. So as you'll see in a minute, I put this at the end, but a very important line of research in our lab together with Massimo Silvetti is to understand these links and how norepinephrine how this loop might be closed with a visual priority map. But for now, let me go a little bit into some behavioral studies. And the one thing that I want to point out about the circuitry is that there are two key players here in regulating our cognitive activity: reward and arousal. Reward and arousal. And if we talk about information demand, arousal is mostly generated by uncertainty. So why do how did we get to uncertainty? Okay, so since this is a computational audience, I think we know that in lay language, we often we use the word information to mean any sort of signal, internal, external, sensory signal. But in a decision theoretic perspective, information has a more precise meaning, and it means the reduction of uncertainty. And we also know that Bayesian, in the Bayesian framework, there's a very specific way in which attention should be deployed in order to reduce uncertainty. So based on priors and likelihoods, in certain situations, you can really precisely compute what is the maximal expected information gain or expected reduction in uncertainty, and that can really specify your attentional policy. And notice that in this Bayesian equation, there is no mention of rewards. So this is all about probability distribution. This logit function quantifies the uncertainty of a probability distribution. There are no rewards here. But of course, there is an implicit assumption in this formula that the hypotheses that are being considered, whatever you're trying to decide, is utility relevant. Otherwise, you wouldn't be interested in it to begin with. And so uncertainty is implicit in this formula, can be introduced explicitly in the formula, and rewards, of course, are also present in the brain, ever present in the brain. So what we are finding through this emerging field that looks at how animals demand information or how they direct their attention is that there is quite a bit of confusion that animals and people also have between minimizing uncertainty and some sort of reward-based function. So rewards can actually interfere with the minimization of uncertainty and can cause suboptimal information sampling. So I want to show this to you from one experiment that we did in which we show this conflict. So we reasoned that in natural decision situations, usually we're faced with multidimensional situations. So for example, when we buy a house, there's several attributes we have to pay attention to that are relevant to the value of the house. So let's say for simplicity, we're considering the roof and the color of the paint. And so, okay, it's reasonable to say that if you think about the value, the roof has, the quality of the roof has more impact on the value of the house than does the color of the paint. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that when you inquire about the house, you should pay more attention to the roof. What determines how much attention you should pay to the roof of the house is how much you know about it to begin with. So let's say that you've already studied the roof and you know all there is to know about it, but you know a little less about the paint. Well, then you should pay more attention to the paint because you have more uncertainty about it. And it doesn't really matter that the paint may not be so valuable in a dollar amount. For your brain, from the point of view of your mental allocation, the paint, thinking about the paint is the most efficient thing for you to do. So we reasoned that this can set up some sort of motivational conflict between reward and uncertainty. And we wanted to see how people resolve this conflict. So we did this. We tried to emulate this natural situation with a greatly simplified lottery task that people did in the lab. So people, on each trial, people were shown two lotteries, and the lotteries were represented like so. So the lottery, each lottery had a mean value represented by this white line, and a range from which it could deliver points represented by the gray area. So for example, the lottery on the left gives an average of 210 points, but it gives variable number of points that can fall in this gray area. The lottery on the right gives 300 points, and it has, and it can vary a little bit around this mean. Now, on every trial, one lottery had a high variance, high uncertainty, like you see here, and the other had a low uncertainty. And then the relative values of the lotteries could change. Sometimes the high uncertainty lottery was lower value, sometimes they were equal, sometimes it was higher value. But the important point here is that both lotteries are relevant to whatever you get. So on each trial, the computer randomly selected a prize from the lottery on the left and randomly selected another prize from the lottery on the right. And then at the end of the trials, it added those prizes, and that is your payoff. So now people played several of these trials, seeing different lotteries with this rule. And the point was that we did not show them the actual precise prizes that were drawn from each lottery. And instead, we allowed people to inquire about a single one of those prizes. So the question is, the prediction here, the optimal prediction, is that if you want to maximize your information about the total payoff, you should always inquire about the prize that has higher uncertainty, right? Just like in the example I've shown you before. And it should not matter at all if this prize has lower value or higher value. That is totally irrelevant to your predictions. Okay, so then if we depict things like so let's say on the x-axis, we draw the relative value, so the high value lottery, high uncertainty lottery minus the low uncertainty lottery. So on the right, the high uncertainty lottery has higher value, so there's no conflict between value and uncertainty. But on the left, the high uncertainty lottery has lower value, so we have a conflict. The optimal prediction is that you should always sample the high uncertainty lottery. The value should not matter at all. And instead, we find that people behave very differently. So these are average data from a fairly large sample of people, over 600 people that we tested in the laboratory and online. We get very consistent results. So the first thing that you can see is that people do not sample the most informative lottery, and especially if there is a conflict. So here, if the most informative lottery is lower value, they want to know the value of the prize from the low variance lottery, even though there's very little they learn about it because the value of the prize is fairly close to the mean. So the information they get here is in a sense redundant, and they leave information on the table. Another important thing here is these 4 conditions that we tested people in. So in the blue and purple traces, the conditions were non-instrumental. In other words, people just, the payoffs were predetermined. It was purely a random draw. People had no control over what money they got. They requested information merely in order to know. So this could be like something like curiosity. And you could say, well, okay, so people don't maximize the information they want, but heck, it doesn't matter really. It doesn't cost them anything. So in the next 2 tasks, though, we made it so that maximizing information had actually monetary value. So in this task that we call estimate, we asked people to guess whether the sum was greater or smaller than some criterion value, and we set it so that if they chose information correctly, they could guess 100%. If they chose incorrectly, they made a lot more errors, and actually they lost money. And finally, in the intervene condition, what happened is that people, for the lottery that they revealed, we then gave them a choice to stay with the amount they revealed or to revert to the mean. But the lottery they did not reveal, there was no control they could exert over the payoff. Again, the optimal strategy is exactly the same because your intervention can have more leverage if you're more informed. And again, people lost money through this suboptimal sampling strategy. Okay, so what do we learn from this? Another thing that I thought was striking is that the optimal strategy was exactly the same on all 3 tasks. And we had very, very few people who had this strategy on all 3 tasks, like 6% of the people. And people who had the optimal strategy, let's say only on the instrumental task when that was that had monetary value, it was another 5%. But overall, we really had just about 10, 11% of people who did the right thing in this task. All right, so what this tells us is that knowing how to gather information is non-trivial, and also that simply introducing incentives does not guarantee optimal sampling. And I suppose that this means that that people would need to have quite protracted learning in order to optimize their information forage.
Hey, Jackie.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, okay, I'll go a little bit about that, but not much more. All right. Okay. So in my title, I think I say something about timescales and discovery. So in these tasks of information sampling that we're doing in the lab, they're quite simplified from realistic conditions. They're simplified in time and in terms of prior knowledge. So in the task that I've shown you so far, it's a one shot. So you just request information and then the next trial is a different world. In realistic conditions, though, people have to investigate questions and situations on extended timescales. So it's more like a study curriculum that you have to organize. Also in the lab, people have prior knowledge about what is informative and what is not. Like in the task that I've shown you, you should know or you can infer that one lottery is more informative than the other. But in realistic conditions, the informativeness of different tasks is not often known in advance. This is what we do in scientific research. We actually cannot be sure that a particular line of investigation will give good results. Things might flop. So we wanted to look in a different study. We wanted to look at an experiment like this that involves learning on longer timescales. What we did here is we gave people the opportunity to interact with 4 different games. Here shown as panels, they're shown as families of monsters. So people on every trial selected a family, and then they saw on step 1. On step 2, they saw a member of that family, and they had to guess what that member has to eat. And on step 3, they got feedback. Did you get it right or not? And on the second trial, they could select another game, and again, the same thing. They could select to stay on the same game or switch among games as they wished. So our interest was in how people allocate their study time across these different games. Over 250 trials. We gave slightly different instructions to 2 groups of people. One group was told to study for a test, so to try to learn as much as they can about all these families. And another group was not told anything. They said, so just do whatever you like as long as you play 250 trials. So what do we find? So importantly, we varied the difficulty of the 4 games. And people discovered this by trial and error. 2 of the games had a one-dimensional categorization to them. So meaning that, so for example, here, this yellow octopus a short octopus would eat a steak, and a tall octopus would eat broccoli. So it was just one dimension categorization. A second family had a one dimension with an irrelevant dimension also being variant. The third activity was a 2-dimensional categorization, which was considerably more difficult. And importantly, the 4th game was random and unlearnable. Okay, so what do we find? How do people allocate their choices? So you see this is here, I'm showing you for a subset of participants in both groups. These people want to challenge themselves in order to learn. And they allocate their time most to the activities that are most difficult. They have the lowest percent correct. And that draws them to really focus on the random and unlearnable activity because, of course, they don't know that it's random. Okay, so we did a little reinforcement learning model in which we tried to understand what motivates people to assign value to a particular activity. And we considered two main components of this utility function. So one was the percent correct, so the percent successes that they experienced on that activity in the recent past. And the other term was the temporal derivative in percent correct. And the reason we looked at this is that in computational studies of active learning, the sort of intrinsic rewards based on learning progress are shown to be fairly effective ways to navigate, to generate sort of discovery in the face of a lot of randomness and unlearnable problems. And indeed, we find it consistent with this theory. So these are, so I'm showing you here people who seem to choose just based on percent correct. So they're just attracted to activities that on which they do not do well. They want to improve on them. So you can see that these people really were stuck on the unlearnable activity. But if you have people who are sensitive just to learning progress and not percent correct, you see that these people really are most efficient in that they focus on A3, which is the hardest learnable activity, but they don't focus on A4. They do not fall into this trap. And that is because they do not sense that they make any progress on it. So this, I think this is pretty exciting because it was the first demonstration as far as we know of that people actually are sensitive to the derivative of performance. Okay, so I won't go through this. Other studies in my lab, if you want to talk about them, have to do with understanding how norepinephrine modulates and uncertainty modulates the priority map. But since I'm out of time, I'll stop here and I'll just say that understanding how people do their active exploration is really a huge, interesting problem. This is non-trivial in simple or more complex conditions. Uncertainty and rewards are a source of confusion for the brain and for behavior. But the most important thing is that all these things are empirical tractable and we really need to study them. And I think you'll agree with that. So I'll just give way to questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Look at that infinity situation happening.
Okay, good. All right.
Okay. Thank you so much. This was pretty awesome. So just to sort of give a bigger picture view, something that I've always really appreciated about your studies was indeed kind of this intersection of learning, curiosity, and I guess, let's say, uncertainty and kind of skill, because some folks seem to be also interested in just, it seems like they find it intrinsically motivating to just improve their skill, as opposed to sort of the external reward of a task that they know very well how to do, the skill they already have. And it's been very interesting to me in the NeurIPS talk that you gave, I guess now it was a year ago, 2 years ago, I don't know, it was about a year ago. You had this sort of also slides about the structure of the environment and how different structures of the environment might trigger different forms of sensitivity to uncertainty and interest in skill learning. Something that you did show right now in one of your slides was that there was a split between folks who were more sensitive or less sensitive to this skill learning intrinsic motivation. So in that bigger picture, it would be awesome if you could say, what do you think is the relationship between the structure of the environment, the statistics of it, meaning an environment I know well and it's very generous. There's like fruits everywhere and there's, I don't know, like rivers of milk and honey everywhere. Or an environment that's a little bit more tough, like, you know, it gets cold sometimes, it gets very hot sometimes, it gets dangerous sometimes. And how those different kinds of environments do you think interact with these senses of curiosity or skill learning? Or do you think, no, it's entirely intrinsic to the brain of individual humans?
No, so it's not entirely intrinsic and it's not entirely environment. I mean, of course, it has to be. So, of course, The exploration, all right, if you, depends, so the key point, the key parameter here is how much you know about your environment, right? So if you are in an environment that's well known to you, I mean, I think this is actually a distinction that we don't make enough, because there are many levels of prior knowledge, and I guess that's what defines your level of uncertainty, right? When you are in a very well-known environment, like what we're doing right now. I know how to participate in a Zoom meeting. I know what to look at. I know what to pay attention to. So this is like the simplest form of uncertainty reduction, I think. And this has very little to do with emotional reactions or anxiety, or I need a level of arousal to be alert. But it really has not a lot of emotion related to it. But if you go to less prior knowledge, if you go to less open-ended environment, then I think we need to go into a very different mode of exploration, which is much more intrinsically motivated, simply because the situation doesn't tell us where to obtain information. So we have to come up with all kinds of guesses, right? So we have to intrinsically generate a sampling policy. We have to also, and we have to also deal with a lot more errors, a lot more possibility of errors. And so there we come into, I mean, I think probably the mental energy that's required, that the amount of arousal that's required is larger, because we need to generate some plasticity. And I think that in those situations is where, other things come into play. Emotions, attitude towards uncertainty, anxiety, that the expectation of positive or negative outcomes, the expectations of danger, and the anticipation of danger, which may not really be veridical. It may not really reflect the probabilities in there. It's also the anticipation of how you might feel if you get information. There was a very interesting study that I saw came from Tali Sharot's lab, where they asked people how they anticipate they will feel if they did X and Y. If they played a lottery, I think it was a probabilistic lottery, how do you anticipate you'd feel if you get a good outcome or a bad outcome? And the interesting finding is that people's anticipations are exaggerated relative to what they actually feel. So they think they will feel much better than they actually do. They think they feel much worse than they actually do. I don't quite know. So it would be really interesting to see what happens, how this plays into exploration, because when we explore, we have to make this calculus. Well, if I find this out, how would I feel? All right. Anyway, it's a long-winded answer, because I think it's a very big question, and I think that there will be a lot of interplay between the environment and the person. And by the way, I think that what we think about as intrinsic attitudes toward exploration, if there is such a thing, probably those are also learned through the past. I mean, I'm not sure that we're born with a lot of these attitudes. I think that how much we explore, how much we expose ourselves to uncertainty is probably a product of a lot of experiences and learning through the lifetime.
So you said a lot of things that I'd like to sort of expand on. One thing that I wanted to ask is maybe how can we tie what you said into the idea of LC and ACC, and in terms of both the novel environments and well-known environments? I think that it might not be necessarily the case that There are no explorations in known environments. It's just that the baseline for uncertainty is in a different place. So prediction errors will be weighed very differently. Inside my home, after like a year of just being locked indoors, if something happens that's unpredictable, the perception of that prediction error is much higher than if I'm in a new city and I don't know what is going on. So I don't have a baseline for what should be my expectations, right? So I might actually be much more sensitive to change in a well-known environment as opposed to a non-well-known environment. And that would correspond, I guess that would relate to prediction errors, the ventral tegmental area, as well as how the ACC would determine, hey, let's break the circuit. We need to do something else. Attention, out brain, something is off. Everybody pay attention to this window that just broke, for instance. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, definitely subjectively, these two kinds of exploration. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is one of the most interesting questions to understand, because mathematically, if you think like a simple act of looking here and there when you're in your home, it can be formally totally equivalent to curiosity, right? Totally equivalent to reading a novel or learning something new. And yet, physiologically, psychologically, we feel very different. So these higher levels of uncertainty somehow trigger some sort of state, some emotional state that's very different from the regular garden variety exploration that we do with our eyes and our senses in a familiar environment. I don't think that anybody really knows what the difference is. I mean, it could be something as simple as the amount of norepinephrine, because we know that the amount of these neurotransmitters is very important. It's just you need to hit the right dose. There's the famous inverted U curve. If you have too much or too little, I don't think that's a sufficient explanation. But something like the amount, the precise amount, might be an important factor. Also, because arousal, because norepinephrine and dopamine are so coordinated, so tightly linked, and they're such dirty drugs. Each one affects the other's receptors. I think that our estimate of the richness or reward probability of the goodness of an environment and our estimate of the uncertainty really color each other, right? So if we anticipate a dangerous environment, I think this is one of the findings that is well documented. If we anticipate a dangerous environment, I think that the focus really narrows, and I think that really inhibits exploration in some way. I'd love to know how it does, what the mechanisms are in there. I mean, how that narrows attention. Because it's not that it shuts you off, it doesn't put you to sleep. It generates a particular type of attention control. And I don't think that we know what that is, but I'd love to know that.
So how does what you said tie into tonic and phasic and norepinephrine?
I have no idea. I really have no idea. So norepinephrine is, it could be. So one of the answers to the question could be that when you have these more extended explorations or deeper explorations, maybe you're looking at tonic levels of norepinephrine to cause a sustained arousal state. But I really don't know. So see, I mean, a lot of this goes to this gap that we have. So we looked at norepinephrine. We look at norepinephrine in relation to pupil dilation and heart rate and just state of awakeness, and things like adjustments of learning rate. Okay, so the adjustment of learning rate gets the closest. I think that so there's more pupil dilation and presumably more tonic norepinephrine in situations in which you have higher learning rates. So you're learning. So there you go. So that could be a correlate of this engaged curiosity-like state. We don't know how that relates to the moment-by-moment control of attention, and this is one of the things that we want to look at in our lab. How does a certain so in addition to being sort of alert and engaged, you have to choose what am I going to pay attention to? What am I going to sample information? Which stimuli I'm going to enhance? Which ones I'm going to suppress? And that is the big question mark here, because we just haven't looked at all these things, uncertainty, norepinephrine, in relation to those priority maps. So hopefully in 5 years, if you have me back, I'll have some answers.
Yeah, in 5 years, this is going to be an in-person event.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I will definitely have answers.
In a stadium. We'll have it in a stadium for you.
At Woodstock.
Right.
That sounds good.
Right.
So that's awesome. Thank you. This really helps. So tonic neurotropy might be related to changes in learning rate, and perhaps that helps sustain a engaged curiosity and exploration state. Something that comes to mind is interesting work by Sonia Bishop. It was a Nature Neuro paper in 2010, where they had pupil dilation and there was aversive learning situation, and they had patients with or people with anxiety and people without anxiety. And it turned out that if people with anxiety had constantly dilated pupils, and so they were less sensitive to learning the changes, to a point where it was detrimental to them and they kept getting shocked more. It was a shock paradigm, as opposed to people who had their pupils mostly shut and it would only widen when there was an actual situation. So I felt like that might be related to this tonic versus phasic. Sometimes it's not good to, and that's what I meant by baseline. Mm-hmm. So it's useful to be sensitive, to adjust one's sensitivity, as opposed to constantly assume that something is needs to be updated. So I think that was a key paper that really stuck with me. This the way that they had correlated that, and they had some nice supplementary material there. Mm-hmm. So do you also link your work to potentially clinical situations where exploration or a lack thereof goes wrong? So this could be situations like anxiety, and when one, or this could be other kinds of situations, or one might, let's say, wash one's hands too often. So with anywhere from anxiety to OCD, it seems like this might be relevant.
Yeah, I think this will turn out to be very relevant to a lot of psychiatric diseases. So I'm not a computational psychiatrist, but I follow that literature. So I know there is at least one paper on OCD where it turns out that people actually gather too much information. So actually they do well, but if you put a cost on gathering information, they end up maximizing accuracy while sacrificing the actual rewards. So OCD is what I know of. Schizophrenia, it seems that there have been many claims that schizophrenia has aberrant belief updating. I think that there's been a recent, more quantitative paper from Guillermo Jorga's lab that doesn't actually substantiate a lot of these claims. I think schizophrenics turn out to have some deficits, some differences in information sampling, but it's not obvious that they certainly update beliefs to the same rate. So it will be interesting to see what's happening there. I think that in the attention literature, there is a lot of documentation for attentional biases related to various psychopathologies. So there's depression, anxiety. So it's I think sometimes called mood congruent bias. So people with depression have biases towards sad stimuli, sad faces, and so on. People with phobias have biases toward the items that trigger their phobias. Right, so you can see how, I mean, so I think there's something very deep there, because if you think about both of these examples are maladaptive, right? I mean, if you have depression, you really want to have the opposite bias. You'd want to remind yourself that the world is a happy place. But somehow, and I often think about this, I mean, I think that our attention and our mental focus sort of follows our physical orienting. So if you think about a frog, right? Let's say about a frog. I hope I'm not insulting frogs, but just bear with me. Or maybe it's some lower organism that I mean. But think about a frog. Okay, so a frog is standing and he sees a fly. Everything in that frog orients toward the fly. So the eyes, the attention, the body, the tongue, everything goes in one direction. So that's the simplest way of controlling attention, is going, whatever you're approaching, your mind also approaches. But in people, we evolved and we somehow dissociated those things. So we can attend to one location in order to gather information that's related to some much more future action that has nothing to do with that location, right? So the reason that I'm looking at you now doesn't mean that I'm going to come there and eat you or whatever, right? So the space in which we select and process information is different from the space in which we move, and so that means that I should be but we have this dissociation. This dissociation is only partly accomplished in us. And we still have that vestige of, okay, if it's a good thing and I want to approach it, I'm going to pay attention to it. If it's a bad thing and I want to avoid it, I won't pay attention to it. And you can see how that's not always.
Negative prediction error, people do pay attention to negative prediction error because it could really help me survive, right?
Right, exactly. That would be optimal. But so optimally, you would pay attention to a negative prediction error or a positive prediction error. Optimally, it shouldn't matter if it's negative or positive. But your motor system is wired to approach a positive prediction error and run away from a negative prediction error. So then your brain also kind of partially runs away from a negative prediction error, if you see what I'm saying, because there is these mental actions have evolved to be yoked to the physical action. That's the simplest design. And we can dissociate them, but only partly.
But I guess you had all these people who were trying, staying more on tasks that they were the worst at.
Yes.
And it was a large proportion of people.
Yes.
This is the people who are actually sticking with the negative prediction error for a long time until they figure it out.
That's actually, yes, that's an excellent point. That's true. That's true. And I don't know how to, I guess you gave me a good idea. Like maybe I should try people. So on one hand, people went with the negative prediction error in order to learn. On the other hand, in the previous experiment that I showed you about, people avoid the lower value thing. They just don't want to think about it. I wonder if maybe I should test people on both and see if they're correlated. But yeah,
I think negative value might be different.
They're different things, though. My feeling is that they're going to be different things, and I really don't know how exactly they're different.
For those of us who do modeling and we dissociate, our models dissociate between learning about states of the world and learning about value. It's easier to capture this because maybe I really want to learn models of the world and I'd stick with my state prediction error or successor prediction error or skill prediction error. But when it comes to value, it's easier. I'm like, all right, this is low value. I don't need to try. Unless perhaps you have a low value thing that has high skill content in it. and then maybe I'll keep going there. It's like staying in academia. You stay somewhere, you're paid less, but you're improving your skill a lot, right?
Right.
I think that combination could be interesting when you have.
Okay, so you think that the difference between those two tasks is that in the first one, the information was about the reward. And in the second one, people learned about a state that's unrelated to,
And that learning is intrinsically motivating for a large population, especially if you did this at Columbia. These are students, like.
No, we did it online.
Okay.
And we found, so by the way, that curve that I showed you where people self-challenge themselves, that was about a third of the people. We had plenty of people who chose the easiest task and stuck with it forever. And they got a lot of green marks. Yes, you know it, you know it. I don't know how they're not bored to death, but that's what they did. And especially if we didn't ask them to study for the test, that we just said play the way one, that behavior was pretty prominent. But what was amazing to us is that we had a third of the people who chose to self-challenge themselves and learn even without any instruction, spontaneously.
Right. That reminds me of the study where they put people in a room to just do nothing and just think. Yeah. And they had the option of shocking themselves, and they preferred shocking themselves to sitting there and getting bored. So I guess like doing the difficult task might be better than boredom to some people compared to others. And Cynthia is asking, was money earned related to performance? Maybe they were enjoying that it was a game they could. No, that's the point.
No,
that it
wasn't not related to performance. They just, no.
Thank you. I guess I'll leave it to Jovo because John is not here. I had more time today to ask.
Yeah. Okay, go. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I feel like I really am missing John right now. Maybe we could just bring Melanie and or Adam on if they're still around. Just so we could all talk about stuff. I think Melanie doesn't seem to be invitable. Adam is.
I will right click on Melanie to see what's her name. She said she would be joining. Okay, good.
Okay, I found her. She's here. So yeah, I think that was cool. I especially like the last part of that discussion. You know, the humans are beautifully heterogeneous. So I think some of us like positive reward and some like negative reward. And as Ida pointed out, we have different values. There's asymmetric value associated with $1 gaining $1 versus losing $1. We value differently, right? They're not equal. And then there was another thing I was going to say. Oh, this issue of your body movement and our inability to perfectly dissociate. Like, I think there's some pretty cool studies where people tried to attend to something where their gaze wasn't directed at it, and we were worse at doing it as compared to when our gaze is directed at it. Do you know those studies I'm talking about?
So, I mean, there is a tight association between eye movements and attention, but people can dissociate they can attend covertly away from their center of gaze. But of course, that's going to be worse because first of all, you're attending to the periphery, so your vision will be worse. But we know that people can attend covertly away from the center of gaze. So it's not so much about gaze and gaze versus covert attention. It's about gaze and attention versus the rest of your body. Because I think that eye movements are really a special kind of movement, and this is something that I think our field has gotten wrong because we use eye movements in many of our tasks. We make, for example, monkeys report a decision with an eye movement. So it's as if we take, so in natural behavior, the people would report their decision with a skeletal movement, like you would reach and grasp an apple, you would press a button, you would speak. All of these movements are sort of exert force on the world, and they can acquire rewards. They can acquire rewards in real life. But an eye movement is really special because it cannot do anything. It doesn't act on the external world, except for social situations. There's a single exception. if you're non-social, there's nothing you can do with enlightenment except change your internal epistemic state, except gather information. It's a movement of a sensory organ, right? So this is the dissociation that I think is most fundamental, is between, are your sensory organs linked to your pragmatic, to your skeletal apparatus? That's what I mean by the motor apparatus. Or are your sensory organs free to explore and sample information that's somewhat distinct from where you're going to move? And can your sensory organs also use like a slightly different utility function than the skeletal apparatus that's more sensitive to uncertainty, for example?
So, okay, so let me respond. Melanie, when I try to invite the Melanie that asked the question, it says that Melanie is not online. So maybe there's multiple accounts and you can log in with the other one or something. I'm not sure.
Let me send you the name of Melanie's current address. It's Melanie Mitchell 4084. That's the one she's currently online with.
Yeah, that's the one I cannot invite on screen.
Huh.
So, okay, I'll proceed, and maybe Melanie, can you try to re-log in as a different Melanie? I don't know if that'll help. So Jackie, my other question is just kind of stepping back, so the Salon, for the most part, we try to tether or understand the connections between a lot of what is going on in natural and human intelligence as compared to machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so a lot of your work and what you've talked about so far is all about kind of the idiosyncrasies of how humans are choosing to behave, which is, of course, really interesting. My question is, to what extent should we be using this information in designing artificial agents? Like, do we want these agents to have these kind of idiosyncratic behaviors, or do we want them to be optimal in some other sense?
I don't know. You should tell me that. Actually, I would like that, because that's also, I mean, obviously, since I like to highlight these quirks of human behavior, of course, the question is, well, why do we have them? Are they useful for anything? And in psychology, I mean, in my field, there's not much I can do about that except hand wave and say, well, yeah, we have these biases towards reward associated, blah, blah, blah. And so that's good in natural environments. So I can hand wave how this has some evolutionary benefit. But I can't really do an experiment on evolution. I mean, I can approximate some things, but I can't do it really well. But it would be really good, for example, if you built some sort of robot that uses one exploration function, that uses, let's say, a totally optimal exploration function versus one that has some of these bugs that I'm describing. And then you can do many, many experiments and tell me in which world is one robot better than the other. Right? That would kind of be interesting. So let me say that, so first of all, having rewards gate information demand, should be in general adaptive, right? Because if you don't have any reward function in your information seeking system, you're going to be caught in all kinds of meaningless information. I mean, there's endless amounts of information in the world, right? So the most famous example, I think, is the white noise paradox. You could, if you see a screen with white noise on it, that is a ton of information. And so every screen is a huge prediction error, and so you should be riveted to that. So if you don't have any utility function gating your information demand, you're going to be really lost. Okay, so some form of utility has to be in there, and maybe that maybe that's what causes this interference in some particular conditions that we're picking up in the lab. But I'd like to know, I mean, this is an experiment you guys could do.
So that white noise paradox is interesting to me, because the way I think about it, and I think, Ida, I'm curious what Ida thinks about this perspective, is when we see white noise, sure, if we wanted to try to predict every pixel, it'd be very difficult. We need to stare at it for a long time. But if we're trying to build an internal model of the world, the white noise screen is trivially easy. It's Gaussian. There's one parameter. We estimate it after like a second with almost perfect fidelity. And then it's boring. There's no more information to get out of that. Ida's shaking her head no because she disagrees.
No, because this actually was a challenge for one of the curiosity-driven algorithms that Deepak Pathak had created, because the algorithm was constantly seeking prediction error. And if you just seek prediction error without paying attention to what Jackie was mentioning, without paying attention to the derivative, then you will get stuck with white noise forever, because it will keep giving you some prediction error. And if you're not paying attention that the derivative is not changing, you'll get stuck there. But if you do pay attention that the derivative is not changing, then you realize there is no information I'm learning here, so I need to move on, right? So in fact, what I'm glad you mentioned white noise. It's been a problem for earlier, by earlier, I mean 2 years ago, curiosity-driven algorithms. It's moved a lot in the past 2 years.
Yeah. And also, but there's also the opposite problem. Because, for example, when I walk down the street and I come to an intersection, I will be interested in the color of the traffic light. That's totally uninteresting from your point of view, because I know the distribution and, there's nothing I'm learning from there, but I am interested in that prediction error, and that's relevant. So really, right. So there has to be a very specific interaction between the utility and the type of prediction errors you're seeking at that point.
So,
and in this case, the derivative, in the specific example that Jovo was mentioning, and the problem that curiosity-driven algorithm had, a prediction error for the sake of prediction error might not improve learning, as in the case of white noise. But the derivative of the prediction error can make you realize whether you're learning something from this prediction error or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It sounds like there's three different strategies to get out of this paradox then. And maybe they're all equivalent in some sense, but one is caring also about utility, one is caring also about the derivative, or one is caring about the model of the world. And I don't know how to parse them and when they're equivalent.
Well, the derivative of the prediction error could be with regard to your model. It doesn't need to be with regard to, so in the case of curiosity-driven learning, you can have no rewards at all, or very sparse rewards, or no rewards. And you can have, so in that case, if you're learning structures of the world, you would want to be, you would want to experience prediction errors that help you update your models in a way that improves your prediction. So I go somewhere, I experience some new things, and then I see whether that new experience has updated my model in ways that I can solve other things better, or I can go further than I used to go. And also, please note that this is a multi-scale thing. So if I'm somewhere that for a PhD, if I go there for 1 week and I see that I'm not a scientist yet, I shouldn't quit, because this is a prediction. This is a kind of a learning that will take longer term, right? But I need a lot of priors and models to even know how long I should anticipate the learning to take. Speaking of what Jackie was saying about and how much we anticipate things to happen, I don't know if you know that experience of learning and expertise happens at times that you don't expect. Like, you don't expect all of a sudden you can play new scales on the guitar. You don't expect it.
Yes.
And, or you expect that you should be solving this equation, and it's like, oh, why is it not working? So it's a very interesting phenomenon. I really like that Jackie was mentioning the prediction people would make versus what actually would happen. I think that not just in the domain of how they would feel, but also in the domain of how much do you think you will learn from this. So to go back to Jovo's comment about the model, so it would be important that the derivative means I'm learning something new in the model, as in my model is testing better. And
Yeah.
that's actually something that I really want to, I've been, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I think this is really, I'm learning something new is very important, but also what you mentioned is that learning doesn't immediately express itself in performance. So this is why, I mean, I think it's a very, very hard problem to estimate when you're learning. Is it good enough? Is it not good enough? Should you stick with this? Should you move to something else? And I think that this is why we need social guidance for this. Honestly, this is why we need teachers. This is why we need schools. I mean, kids do not learn. I mean, you know, if any of us, you put in the wild, we probably wouldn't learn the alphabet on our own. There's a lot of stuff we wouldn't learn. We might learn the alphabet after many years, but a lot of stuff we wouldn't learn, right, without guidance. And also, yeah, and also this idea that like, so learning progress is great and could work, but again, you're not expressing it. So let's say I'm trying to play the piano, and we all know this. I mean, if John was here, he could tell us better than all. I mean, learning performance changes in very discrete ways, irregular ways, is nonlinear. So you may need to practice for days before, you know, then on Monday, all of a sudden you got better. Right? So it's really hard to know how you monitor. This is where I think the social information comes in.
Cool. Well, that was really an interesting answer. Thank you so much. I know, Adam, you may have to go soon. Do you want to ask your question next so you get to it?
Sure, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, thank you very much. This was all extremely interesting. As someone from a signal processing background, I'm really excited to see adaptive sampling show up. I think it's amazing stuff. I had one question, maybe a little bit about the formalism. Right, there's in all other models, there's one feedback loop, right? Something either going into using the reward in an RL setting, or using something like a signal fidelity or uncertainty to adjust and feedback into how you're sampling the world. But this model, you have both, right? And so how does that mesh in a formal way? I mean, how do you account for all of that information and for this tension that you've set up between these two pieces of information, such that the person can make these informed choices on modifying strategy versus modifying sensing versus changing what task they're doing?
Right, modifying strategy versus modifying senses. Yeah. So I think that a lot of this is done implicitly. Natural behavior, when you, if you stick with a task and you're learning a whole task, I think that you optimize information gather, your sensing and your motor output simultaneously. And it's a very implicit process. So I think you learn how to attend very much in the same way that you learn how to move. A lot of it is unconscious, a lot of it is implicit, and you just, because also like the attentional optimization is, it happens, you shift your attention 4 or 5 times a second. So these are very, very fast movements. You can't, and actually it has been shown that there's a lot of learning of eye movements involved in learning skilled behaviors. It's been shown in driving. So novice drivers, they look everywhere. Their eyes are all over the place. But after practice, it's amazing how reproducible the eye patterns become from person to person and the same person across time. So there's a lot of optimization going on there. I think that but we just don't know. We just haven't studied the learning process very much. It would be interesting to look at it. Well, a difficulty in studying it is I don't know. I mean, how would you quantify it, right? So ideally, you'd want to understand what is the person's internal model at every point in time as it evolves, right? Which seems like an impossible, because it's just too complicated. But I wonder how, like, in other ways, so you could try to get at this question by looking at looking at the time course of motor learning in parallel with information sampling, with sensation learning, right? So you could set up a task like that. I'm not aware that that has been done anywhere. Right. So okay. So this is one part of your question. How do you optimize sensation and action? Right. I think it's done together. And the second part was, how do you decide to disengage and do something else? And I think that's that higher level monitoring circuit that tells you, like, having to do with the frontal cortex, that tells you, okay, how tired are you? There must be some sensation of fatigue. So what are the costs? So this extra norepinephrine that you call for, that you need for learning, that is a cost, and maybe that's cumulative. And I think it's a computation like that at some point is away. But yeah. So basically in the brain, I think, there are two circuits. So one is a frontal circuit that says stay on the task or go do something else. And all the other sensory motor learning, I think, takes place in the rest of the brain.
So kind of like a switching between exploration, exploitation type of mechanism versus adapting like the fine-grained details.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that would be a frontal decision. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Hey, Melanie, you want to ask your question?
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for this great talk. So it's, to some extent, you've already answered some of it, but I'm really interested in this notion of this monitoring circuit that's getting a sense of how we're doing, how well we're doing at solving the task, and then decides to take action based on that. And I'm wondering how much detail is known about how that works, and what attributes does it pay attention to, this circuit? What feedback does it get? Like, is there anything that you can tell more about how it's working?
Okay, so we're fairly sure that this part, the anterior cingulate, is an important component of it. And we're fairly sure about the circuit that I drew, that the anterior cingulate communicates with dopamine neurons and projects to the locus coeruleus. But okay, now there's a lot more stuff that we don't know. So first of all, we know very little about how these neurotransmitters act, particularly on sensory systems. What do they do to information processing? So that's one big unknown. The other big unknown that you hinted at in your question is, it's what do people want, in a sense. So what if this monitoring circuit gets inputs from some sort of reward system, so the dopamine system, we think of it as a universal reward. We really only studied, well, what we call a reward is a drop of water for a thirsty animal, or food for a hungry animal, right? It's like the lowest level possible. Right? So now there has been a study showing that dopamine neurons also respond to anticipating information. So if you anticipate a signal that will reduce your uncertainty, dopamine neurons have a little blip. Now that blip is a lot smaller than the blip that they would see if you actually get a reward or a prediction of an actual reward. Nevertheless, there is a little blip when you just anticipate information. And some people say they can see it also with imaging in humans. Okay, So that's a higher order utility. So could that be that that's what motivates you to, want to be curious, and then your ACC says, okay, engage in this learning task? It's possible. That's what people think. But then there's all kinds of other rewards. And I think that the state of the field today is to reflexively say that all kinds of other rewards, social rewards, whatever, they're all dopamine. It's all dopamine. I mean, it's probably not true, but that's just as much as I know about it. Right. So, yeah. So,
but so you're saying it's not all about uncertainty reduction. That's not the only thing that we're monitoring.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not. I mean, it's not everything we're monitoring. I mean, I think one really important thing that we're monitoring is also the cost of uncertainty reduction, which would be fatigue and time. By the way, the effort, the costs of processing information, that's another huge area that I hope we're just seeing papers coming in now, because there's so many costs involved. If you talk about the visual information, just visual search, just finding things. And then there's the processing, and sometimes you need more focus, and sometimes you need less focus. It's an easier signal. It's a bigger letter on the screen, or it's a tinier letter, right? That has cost, and we all know how we, may not like to read something because we don't like the way it looks, or it's too much effort to just see it, right? Another cost is the cost of actually computing the sampling policy. Sometimes that is costly in itself. Okay, so in addition to, reduction of uncertainty is one thing, but then there are also the costs that the circuit should estimate. I think there probably are many other motives, and there are probably many other social motives, agreement and affiliation. Those are probably other motives that are not related to uncertainty reduction, may even interfere with it, right? Because they're so social agreement and affiliation. I mean, think about what's happening today. We actually absolutely discard some information, absolutely do not want to hear it. Right? So I think that there are many motives. So social psychologists, there is a whole field of motivational psychology that talks about human motives in a broader sense. And I think they identified, this is basic high school psychology courses, you learn this. So they identified several needs and motives. I forget what they are, but I think there were 7 of them. We are not quite there. We don't have those mapped into brain systems, right? Hopefully it will happen.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a fascinating area.
Yeah.
I'm good.
So Cynthia's showing. Oh, hi, Cynthia.
Hey, I appeared. Sorry. Hi, yeah, it's nice to hear from you. I think it's a really interesting talk. Let's see. I asked something a lot earlier when you were really in your data,
Okay.
which was that you were talking about people having 2 main types of strategies. One that was more about, performing really well. One that was about learning.
Yeah.
And during one of the tasks, there was different levels of difficulty, and you saw people, from what I could understand, actually switch strategies. And so I was curious if you were doing fMRI or EEG, or if you have an animal equivalent, if there was something neurologically you might have seen when you saw participants switch strategies.
I did not talk about switching strategies in my task. And so I think what you're referring to in there, I was comparing 2 kinds of people. So people were choosing, were playing with those games. Some people were more seemed to be attracted to just games where they had low % correct. So their idea was whatever's harder, that's what I need to study right now. And then there were people who seemed to be more sensitive to the derivative of % correct. So meaning that, I want tasks that are not so easy, not super easy, but also not super difficult that they're unlearnable. So that will push them towards an intermediate. So I don't think that I have a switch of strategy in my task, but it would be interesting to see. Of course, it would be interesting to see. I have what I have in my task is different individuals pursuing different strategies, and we looked. So whenever we do these studies, we took a few personality questionnaires to try to look at personality traits. So far, we really didn't see anything, any correlations. I have now a project that does sort of a meta-analysis. We take about 10 tasks of information demand that were developed in different labs, and we put them all on Amazon Turk, and we had people play all of these 10 tasks, including personality questionnaires. So we're going to attempt to do sort of a meta-analysis to see, do we have sort of some latent dimensions that can explain. Maybe it has to do with attitudes toward uncertainty. I don't know, but we'll see if we can get to it like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey,
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the really fascinating talk. My question is about the first experiment. When you mentioned that only 5%, or including the other 10% of people were really optimizing their strategy to gather information. And I was wondering if you saw anything that is common in those particular population.
No, we didn't. I guess you know what? I guess I shouldn't say no. We're still kind of analyzing the data. So we actually did not look. We have questionnaires about them. What I can tell you is what we didn't find in a previous study. I mean, we did not find an association with education, yeah, I mean, with gender, with risk preference, that's what we look for. There's these BIS-BAS questionnaires that are approach and avoidance personality. So in the past, we did not. What is even more interesting is that, okay, so you could say, okay, so you could imagine sort of a recursive algorithm. So how do I learn a sampling strategy, right? I have to learn this source of information is better than the other one, right? How do I learn something about the source of information? Well, it might have to do with how I use the information. So let's say in our task, if people understood the rule, the task would be really, really easy to do. So for example, when we had the estimation task, it was, so you have your two lotteries, you choose to inspect one, and you get a value, you get a number. And then I'm asking you, and then there will be a second number drawn from the other lottery, and you have to estimate, is the sum of them bigger or smaller than the average, than a benchmark? Now, if you understand the rule, you don't have to do the mental addition. So the numbers are 2 3-digit numbers. So a very laborious strategy would be to really add this, and they say, okay, this number plus that number, what would that be? And this number plus that number, what would that be? Right, that's the laborious way. But if you understand the rule, you understand that if you reveal the high uncertainty lottery and you get the high number, it's always bigger. If you get the low number, it's always smaller. Right? That's a very simple rule. On the other hand, if you reveal the low uncertainty lottery, big or small doesn't matter because you're at 50-50. It doesn't, they're both on the same side of the category. They could be either side of the categorization boundary. So you could say, okay, well, maybe people who got the rule they discovered that it's really easy to sample one thing and then use the simple rule. But the interesting thing is when we looked at the reaction times of the people, it seemed that many of them got the rule because they have flat reaction times and the accuracy of their decision doesn't depend on reaction time. So it doesn't seem that they spend time thinking and this. They got the rule, but they still, most of them don't get what to do to use that information efficiently. So it's all like very interesting. It's all a very big puzzle. Yeah, so I don't know. To answer your question, I really don't know. I'm also working now with a more social psychologist, social affective. Yeah, these people know more about personality and stuff. So I'm hoping that maybe will find the quirk, really, who does it right, and who are these people who do it right. I don't know.
May I ask a quick follow-up question? Thank you. Did you ask the participants to explicitly explain what they were doing? Like after the task?
Yeah, no, I didn't. Maybe I should have. I didn't. I did have one person, but he was not a subject. He was a student, and I showed him the task, and he said he's an economics student, and he said, "Oh yeah, well I know that I should be interested in that, but I really don't want to be interested in that. I really want to see the higher value one. And so if you put no cost on it, I'm going to look at the higher value one, even though I know that it's the wrong answer." So I was hoping that, okay, so that's a good intuition. So I was hoping that a person like that, if there is no cost and it's just observing, may do the apparently wrong thing. But the moment you put a monetary cost on it, they should switch to do exactly the right thing. But I guess, like you saw, that only happened infrequently. So maybe those were econ students. There was 11%. I don't know. I don't know. We should, but I should qualify that actually for that particular experiment, we didn't finish analyzing their demographic data and their questionnaire. So if I find something there, I'll let you know. Yeah.
Hey, Brad.
Hi.
Brad.
Time traveling Brad.
Yep.
Yeah, Brad time travels in computer technology in his background.
No, we just bought this
Okay.
because it's the lab. It's brand new. I apologize that I missed your talk. I was giving a seminar.
Okay.
One of the things I gathered bits and pieces about this idea of sort of tracking the derivative of prediction error, and I think that that's a really fascinating way of thinking about this. I was wondering, what are your thoughts about why people are sort of glued to gambling tasks, like roulette, etc.? Cases where they might know rationally, you know, in some cases that there is no signal to be discovered. Like for people might like literally know that gambling is completely random and yet still feel compelled to do it in some cases. So do you have any thoughts about what might be going on in cases where people do that, especially to the point of, you know, addiction and just getting stuck down the rabbit hole?
Yeah. So I actually have two hypotheses about that. So first of all, I think that, so the derivative, so learning, this derivative of prediction error, I think that it is a signal in the brain that the brain tracks, but I think it's certainly not the only signal, and I think it may not even be such a strong signal. We may track it sometimes, but like I was saying, I don't know if you heard the discussion, I was saying how actually it's very hard to track the derivative of, like if you're learning a task, if you're trying to improve, because learning doesn't immediately express itself in performance, right? So you might feel like you're learning, it might feel good, but you're not actually learning, and so you're not sensing any derivative in prediction error per se, right? So this derivative function is problematic to measure in principle, and I don't think that it's the strongest of these exploratory drives. And I think that just local prediction errors, like the garden variety dopamine, like instantaneous, I think that those could actually be pretty powerful. And in addiction, this is what people think. So that's my answer number one. Answer number two, I'm gonna turning back to the prediction error, I think that to the derivative and the sense of learning, I think that people imagine structures and people think they're learning. So we even saw this in our task with a random task, right? So people were stuck with it, and I guess it's true. We concluded that people tend to be stuck on it if they really don't monitor the prediction error. But also we had some questionnaires at the end of the session, and we got some really strange answers. So we asked people, how much more do you think you could improve on this task if you stuck with it? And a lot of people said, oh, we can improve a lot more. And then we asked them, do you think this task has any rule? And they usually said, no, it probably doesn't have a rule. But at the same time, they thought they could improve on it. Right. So I think people. So I think people can be inconsistent in assessing. They can have a feeling of learning, and I think that the brain kind of monitors, because the actual learning is actually very difficult to monitor. That there can be no outward. There could be this outward signs of it can be inconsistent. I think that the brain uses heuristics, and basically, if you feel like you're engaged or alert, if there's signals coming at you, I think that may give you a feeling of learning, which is the subjective feeling, so then you'd say you're learning. Okay, so I think I mentioned two things. So first of all, the small garden variety prediction errors are powerful. You can have a mistaken feeling of learning. And the third thing is, I think people actually invent patterns in random sequences, right? I think we know this. It's actually very difficult to decide that something is totally random and unlearnable. And people invent patterns. We're doing now a task in monkeys in which we absolutely see that they invent patterns. We give them a totally random images, and we just there's a set of 5 or 7 images, and we present them in pairs of 2, and they have to choose one. So A is better than B, and then they see B and C, and they choose B or C, and then they see C and D, and so now we give them rewards randomly, but the monkeys start behaving as if there is a hierarchy. So they decide at some point that A is better than B, and B is better than C, and C is better than D, and they choose consistently, and to the extent that they ignore the rewards. So that's another thing that people create fictitious orders.
So do you think that casino games have sort of evolved to tap into maybe like all 3 of those, perhaps?
I think so.
So not one explanation, but like a combination of those 3.
I think so. I think so.
I have some prediction error in the Jovo screen.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I transported a few decades forward in time.
Joe, but that's an even grimmer future reality than we currently live in.
I'm sorry, The Matrix came out in 2000, and it was shot between 1998 and 1999, so I wouldn't say that's the future.
But what year was it supposed to take place then?
Yeah, isn't it like Like some uncountable number of hundreds of years?
I don't know.
Good question.
I'm just really the sci-fi expert here.
Yeah, and I feel bad that I don't know the answer to that. What year was Matrix like? I'm going to say 2024, but I'm sure that's wrong.
So, Brad, I have I think a much simpler response to your question about playing the lottery, which I think is a really good question. It relates to what we were saying earlier about the heterogeneity of people. Like, consider the following scenario. Someone you love needs surgery. The surgery costs a few $100,000. If they don't get it in the next few months, something terrible happens. You don't have a few $100,000. The lottery is your best option. It's the optimal thing to do. You can't invest and get $100,000 in a month. Or gambling is another, just gambling more generally at a casino. So I think when we talk about optimality, we have to consider people's kind of cost-benefit analysis in their risk profile. And so playing the lottery can totally be optimal and totally not, and it just depends on context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true for a small variety, perhaps, but I think there's also a big chunk of individuals who do it where it's really difficult to ascribe any positive utility to that. Oh,
I'm here. Sorry,
okay, yeah.
It's freaking me out. Sorry.
I mean, there are certainly some people though who gamble way beyond like any conceivable utility function, I would think. People who just continually like have lost everything, recover, and then go right back and do it again.
Yeah.
But again, that could I mean, there are lots of different types of people and lots of different motivating functions for.
Isn't that addiction?
Yeah. Right.
That is addiction. So I guess for all of these behaviors, I mean, the question is not so much. The problem is not so much that we have some mechanism that seems that seems wrong in a particular situation, right? Because then we can always say, well, but in general, that mechanism could be useful in other situations we might encounter. The problem is that whatever mechanism we have, we cannot turn it off, even when it's clearly maladaptive. So the problem is not so much with the mechanism. The problem is with some higher level control that says, okay, use this strategy now and use that strategy next. Yeah.
But I was wondering, I asked this question earlier in the chat. I was wondering if you're familiar with the darkroom problem, which is kind of another analog of the TV noise problem.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not super familiar, but from the little I know is that, yes, I mean, if you have a utility function that tries to minimize uncertainty, you'll go to the dark room and stay there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That minimizes uncertainty. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. And exactly, in my understanding, that's another extreme that learning progress-based mechanisms, they guard against that too, because they would say, wait, in the dark room, I'm not making any learning progress. Maybe I have no uncertainty, but no uncertainty isn't really the goal. Learning progress is the goal. And so that I don't get that in the dark room. I don't get that with the random noise. I need to be somewhere in between.
So Brad suffered from technical difficulties, maybe his computer. Oh, yeah, we have Javier. So problem solved. Hey, Javier, welcome.
Hey.
Hi.
I will apologize that I missed the presentation part for the talk, but I think I've caught up more or less until now. But I'd invited me to talk about some learning experiments in rodents I did, which I think are highly related. So the quick summary is that I did a perceptual task in rodents, and instead of just focusing on asymptotic performance, I tracked the entire learning trajectory. And I used like the drift diffusion model is a general tool. Like the drift diffusion model did a fine job, approximating their accuracy and reaction times. I don't want to dwell on it too much because, obviously it's fraught, like what decision model to use, et cetera, but it's such a robust tool. There's like so many analytical tools around it that it seemed like it made sense. One of them in particular is the fact that you can tell whether an agent is optimally accruing reward if you assume that they're, using a drift diffusion process. So if we just apply that during the learning trajectory, what we find is that at the beginning of learning, the rats were highly suboptimal, meaning they were not accruing reward, optimal reward rate. But by the end of learning, they were, most of them were accruing like over 99% of the optimal reward rate. So the question is, what's going on here, right? And I want to highlight that I think that this is not only true for rats. I just think, like you had mentioned, Jacqueline, there's a dearth of study on the actual learning trajectories. I think in general, people sort of gloss over it and focus on everything else. So I think this is an observation that many people have seen in their own experiments. Maybe it's not published. Sometimes it's published, but it's not really analyzed. So in any case, we just sort of dived into it, and we created a...
muting yourself. There's some feedback that's very... Do you have chimes? Okay.
Yes, there are chimes. I can close this door.
That's what I was hearing. I was hearing chimes.
It's extremely windy here.
I think I heard an elephant too somehow.
Extremely
and then
windy.
it was getting feedback through Jackie's open mic, so it was getting even louder.
Okay. So we created a model to try to understand what the rats were doing. So in the model, we could feed it different objective functions for learning and see what matched the rat's trajectory. So if we gave the model an objective of maximizing instantaneous reward rate, then obviously it did not match the rats. But it did follow this theoretical curve called the optimal performance curve that tells you the optimal combination of accuracy and reaction time, across all error rates. So then we said, okay, well, what if we give it an objective function that essentially decays towards the optimal reward rate, but slowly, and we give it a prior of a slow initial reaction time, which would allow much more stimulus accrual, and this matched the rat's behavior. So the implementation itself is heuristic. I think there are many different ways that you could get the same sort of curve. That's not the point we're trying to make. The point is that a policy of maximizing instantaneous reward rate cannot give you efficient learning, right? And this is in a very impoverished scenario, right? It's two alternative forced choice tasks, binary choices, et cetera, but this allows us to sort of nail down the whole problem. And the argument we're trying to make here is essentially you have to forego a cognitively easier strategy, which is just guessing quickly, and you also have to forego a much higher reward that's available to you in order to prioritize learning, right? Which is what we found the rats do. So that probably requires some sort of control process, right? And this is where I think the learning monitoring comes into play. Like you need some sort of mechanism to counterbalance the reward that you could be accruing now, saying like, hold on a second, I am learning, so I should give up on the current reward that is available to me.
So how did you motivate your rats to do that? We can't, I mean, we sometimes try to motivate our monkeys to forego an immediate reward. Actually, it doesn't work so well. Our monkeys, like, if it's not trivial. I didn't try very hard, but how did you get your rats to do that?
Well, in our case, the reward was water. So we had water-deprived rats, and the reward they got was water. And I mean, the thing is that I think maybe perhaps...
Sorry, but what you said is that, if I understood correctly, you said that you got the rat to refuse an easy, immediate reward in favor of a more difficult, lower probability rewards that leads them to learn? Did you get them to do that trade-off?
Right. So perhaps to clarify, what I mean with that is that the strategy that's available to them is, they can always just guess quickly, and they will achieve some reward rate that is higher than if they actually have longer reaction times, where they observe the stimulus for longer and they improve their internal signal to noise ratio. Right. So it's always possible for them to guess during the task. They can always do that, and when their ability, their automaticity, whatever you want to call it, is low, that is a strategy that will get them a much higher reward rate. And yet they do not do that. And because they can do many trials quickly at 50%. Exactly. Yeah. And we replicated this, we taught them a first set of stimuli and we saw this pattern, and then we taught them a second set of stimuli and we saw the same pattern again. So it wasn't necessarily based on just like learning the task mechanics or anything like that. We also ran a few other experiments to make sure that it had to do with learning itself. So after we had trained a cohort that learned appropriately, we asked them to learn new stimuli, but we separated them to two groups. In one group, we showed them visible stimuli that were possible to learn. And in another group, we showed them basically invisible stimuli. So there's no information there. And what we found was that the group that had the learnable stimuli replicated the same trajectory, the same reaction time trajectory. The group that had the non-learnable stimuli had an initial slowdown where they're probably learning that there's nothing to learn, and then sped up tremendously to try to maximize instantaneous reward rate. So there, it's clear that there's a monitoring, like, hold on a second, there's nothing to learn here, so I should not invest in learning, and my strategy is to switch to maximizing instantaneous reward rate.
Yeah, that is really interesting. That is very, very interesting. We should look at that paper. Yeah, it seems very relevant.
If you can put that in the chat, if you have that paper. And also it's related to Gary Kane's work, 2017, which was a paper with John Cohen and Gary Aston Jones, who had written the original integrative theory of locus coeruleus and norepinephrine function. And there they had, the title of that paper is Increased Locus coeruleus Tonic Activity Causes Disengagement from a Patch Foraging Task. So they had rodents forage different environments with lever pressing, and then there were different conditions. And I would say that that's related also to the earlier conversation that we had, Jackie, about the tonic versus the phasic locus coeruleus. Oh God, that's
yeah. Super interesting. There is this one paper that I think of, I think from Amitai Shenhav's lab, where he did this really cool experiment. He asked people to make choices. So he had two food stuffs, and he had people declare how much they like each one. And he asked them to make choices. And sometimes he gave them items that had clearly different values. One was better. But sometimes he gave them equal value items. And people were a lot more anxious choosing among those equal value items, right? And there was also different brain circuitry. I mean, I think he's seeing slightly different parts of the anterior cingulate light up in those two cases. And I think, in a sense, it's similar to your to the trade-off. But so your rat has a choice. I can make a choice right now quickly, maybe get more reward, but I really don't know what I'm doing. I don't have the sense that I know what I'm choosing, right? It's random. Versus I can invest some time so that I can make an informed choice, so I can be confident. So yeah. So I think there's something like that. I think there's a sense of controllability or confidence, or one of those that's really important in the type of choices we want to make.
Yeah, from Amitai's lab, I think the word that they're using is efficacy. So they, as far as I know, they use like I'm trying to use now, this expected value of control theory, right? Which is just essentially like porting over like a cost benefit trade-off from economics and saying like control should be applied in proportion to you know, the affordances it gives me in the world around me. And they introduce this concept of efficacy, which is in some situations, it doesn't matter how much control I exert, I'm not going to improve my reward landscape, right? And so, you know, I'm not aware of this particular story you're talking about, but it's funny because in that case, people are assigning more control to the decision. They're anxious, they're focusing on it more, and yet there is no extra reward to be had. So it almost seems like a misfiring of the system.
Right, but the utility function is not just about rewards. So we know that. I mean, that's a big deal. It's not just about rewards. So
yeah.
So there must be that there is some cost there to responding without confidence or responding randomly. There is a cost. So it's aversive to people, and that cost maybe is anxiety or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that totally makes sense. Yeah, in our case, so what I'm currently trying to do is treat learning as a control problem because, you know, as I more or less show with the rat study, I mean, and I'm not the only one to have shown this, I feel like it's a fairly general concept, people think about this, but learning requires that you trade the rewards that are around you, you know, in the surface of learning, right? So to do that, you need to override your system. You need to be goal directed, which requires control. And so, you know, how can we expand one of these control theories to make this happen? So it's the problem I'm currently trying to solve. And I am definitely going to try to read this sci-archive paper that you're talking about, because we would like to measure, you know, how people monitor their own learning, because this is sort of like a mystery. And how does it, I mean, it's difficult, like you said, because there's especially I'm realizing now moving to humans, there's so many different compounds, so many things you have to avoid. It's just like a whole new world.
Very different. Yes, it becomes difficult to set it up experimentally. Yeah, that's true, but keep at it.
So Jackie, is this the paper you had in mind? The one, the PNAS paper, Neural Correlates of Dueling Affective Reactions to Win-Win Choices?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
When you have two winning options, then you become stressed about it even more.
Yes, right.
And that kind of is reflected in, I mentioned also the expected value of control paper from Neuron, where they have a kind of computational theory that accounts for why the effort goes higher when you have indecision, because two things are too close to each other to decide, as opposed to distant enough so it's easy to choose them.
Right.
Cool. Thank you so much, Javier. It was great to see you. Thank you for sharing your paper with us, and thank you for the discussion. Jackie, I guess you should be tired by now. It's 6:05.
Yeah, this is fun. This is fun. I'm actually all energized.
I'm happy to hear that. Thank you so much for joining us. I wish that John was here. It would have been a lot more fun because he brings a certain level of dynamic
shots. He brings shots.
That's dynamic. That's true. I miss him. I miss him. I mean, he was my colleague at Columbia, and then he left. So yeah. He has to record some outrageous comments for me and send them.
Yeah.
That's a good plan.
Well, I guess I'm gonna just attend your future salons. And
we would love it.
Thank you so much.
Ask questions, come on screen, ask questions from others.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, this is very nice. So is this a pandemic motivated thing, or?
We've been doing this since September, so it is a pandemic motivated thing, but it's so much fun that we might keep it. I don't know what's going to happen. Hopefully one day it would be at Woodstock.
Okay, that's wonderful. And where are you now, Ida?
Oh, I'm at Microsoft Research in New York City.
Oh, you're still in New York. Okay.
Yeah, Brooklyn.
Okay. Brooklyn. Okay, great. Okay, great. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's great fun. And okay, I'll try to show up again in the future.
we look forward.
nice night.
I also want to say thank you to Claire, to Eva, who have been behind the scenes and helping us out, and also to Brad and to Kanika, although I think she couldn't make it. And yeah, to everyone who asked their questions, and please join us next week. We're going to be a little bit more AI oriented next week. And then the week after that, we're going to have a recap and discussion where, as you know, it's usually some of our most dynamic sessions where we do a recap of the speakers, like a midterm before we have the next speakers of the semester. Thank you again, Jackie.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice weekend. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.